All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna continue the conversation of sealers, use case scenarios. Let's see what I could think of. But right now, I think what I wanna do is I wanna focus on just topicals and things to take into consideration with topicals. So if you haven't seen my previous overview video on sealers, please watch that video first before watching this one. Or if you already have some knowledge as far as how sealers work, then come on, let's get going. So right now, what we're going to concentrate on is we're going to concentrate on the tree of topical sealers. All right, so the things to take into consideration. So in my previous video, I mentioned there's no best sealer. It's only what sealer is best for you. So in this case, we'll talk topicals. As far as topicals go, let's think of how they work, okay? So now the thing is you have a material, right? Whatever that material is. This material could be a slab outside in your home. This could be tiles inside your home. This could be in a shower. It could be in a floor. It could be on a wall. It doesn't matter where it is. Just think of a surface. And the best thing to do is, if you're watching this video, it's probably because you got something going on. You got a project going on. You have a problem happening, and you're trying to figure out why and do a lot of research, which we field a lot of phone calls that ask about, I don't know which one to use. I've researched, I've done some homework, I can't figure it out. So take the information that I'm telling you and apply it to what you got going on. And like they say, if the shoe fits, wear it. If not, let it slide, right? Okay, so in this case, how do topicals work? So topicals can be acrylic, or it could be polys, or it could be epoxies. Okay? Now, from this side to this side, think easy, hard, OMG. Okay? Think of that as far as removal goes. Right here, you would need a stripper. Over here, you would need a super stripper. Over here, usually, you need sanding or grinding. So think of future maintenance when deciding which one you want to go with. And then also, when you're thinking of which one you want to go with, understand that the harder it gets, the more expensive it becomes, the more labor intensive it becomes. But there's also an upside to it, which is durability, right? Because the harder something is, the more it lasts. But then the question is that some people don't take into consideration is, let's say you go with the hardest of the hardest of the hardest of it all, and it's going to last you 10 years. In 10 years, when it's time to redo this, it's going to cost you, $15,000. Okay? The poly, super stripper. This is going to last you, let's say, 7 years. And out of that 7 years, this right here might cost you $5,000. That wasn't much of a five, was it? $5,000, right? You go with acrylic. With acrylic, it's probably going to be annual. So every 1 year. But every time you do it, it's going to cost you, let's say, $950 to $1,350. Now, I'm making these numbers based on let's say a 500 square foot average. I think that's about right. Because when you think of a standard 2-car garage, because when I think of epoxy, I think of garages. When I think of garages, standard 2-car garage, roughly 500 square feet or so. Same thing with polys and what? Yeah, I think this is a good number for about 500 square feet. So use this and keep that in mind with whatever project it is that you got going on. So let's say you got to do this annually. Okay, times 10, right? Because this one right here was a 10-year situation, right? Okay, 1,350 times 10. Let's call this one every 7 years. So it's 5,000 if it's every 7 years, then it'll be 14 years. That 14 years would then cost you 10,000. So just looking at those numbers right there, now the question is, how hard do you need the epoxy to be in the location that it's in for every 10 years to cost you 15 grand? Where are you putting the poly that you need a hard top of a topical that's going to last you 7 years at $5,000 in 7 years? So in 14 years, it'll be $10,000, which is already 5,000 cheaper than if you were to go with the poly, at 10-year mark. Now, if you're dealing with an annual situation, an annual headache, but when you associate that headache with the price that it could be, you could see that it's a lot lower than the 7-year or the 10-year mark. But it doesn't mean that you should completely omit the poly or the epoxy, because then now it determines, well, what are you trying to protect and where is it located and what situation are you dealing with and what's going on, right? So let me go ahead and let me clear that up a little bit. Okay, so now we'll continue and talk about the surface. So now the question is, where's the surface located? Is it inside? Is it outside? Okay, we'll begin with the easy stuff. The easy stuff to me, I think, is the outside, right? So right now, let's go outside. On outside, let's say that you have, because I already have it as a block, let's talk about stamped concrete. So what is stamped concrete? Stamped concrete is a large concrete foundational base where they use these really cool stamping, I don't even know what to call them, like a rubber stamp, where they literally put like a carved out template on the concrete as it's still pliable and it's hard, but it's still soft enough to take on the shape of that template. So I'm not gonna even try to draw it, but let's just say that it's a template that just shows some fake grout lines, right? That's it. It's a template that shows some fake grout lines. In which case, this is still one solid piece of concrete. Okay? So it's still just one solid piece of concrete. So because it's one solid piece of concrete, you don't have to worry about evaporation. So if, let's say that this is in your backyard and you have a back patio, concrete patio, stamped concrete patio with a beautiful design, well, when water gets in the ground and the dirt underneath, it's going to want to evaporate. And remember, evaporation, water takes the path of least resistance. So over here, this is the hardest of resistance. It's not going to go through the slab. It's going to go at the ends of the slab. Wherever it is that it ends, that's where it's going to push out, and that's where it's going to permeate. That's where it's going to evaporate from, which means that you're going to have zero issues with absorption, or with evaporation, trying to go out, because it's not even going to get that far. So in a stamped concrete scenario, you can totally put a topical. You can totally put a topical on here, get that beautiful, beautiful coating that's on there. Then once you have that coating on there, it protects your concrete, keeping your concrete intact, looking great, looking beautiful. So then now the question is, let me clean this up a little bit. Okay, so that right there is just to illustrate that you can put a topical on a stamped concrete type of scenario. So then now the question is, well, do you put an acrylic or do you put a poly? Well, earlier I just showed you the cost of removing one versus the other. So then now it's kind of like, what's your situation? Are you in a house that you're only going to stay there about 2 years? What do you want on there? Because whichever one it is that you choose, you're not going to deal with, and then that's where it's up to you to decide what you want to put in there, because what you choose to put in there, when you sell it, the next person has to deal with. And the unfortunate part is we catch those callers and we catch those people saying, we just bought this house, we didn't know what we had, now we have this problem, how do we fix it? So the cost associated with the decision you made gets passed on. I've had customers, so now it's story time really quick. I've had customers, transparently speaking, I've had customers tell me they don't care. And then I've had some really outstanding customers that tell me, I don't want to leave the next people that I'm selling the house with, or that I'm selling the house to, with a problem. I want to do it right. Kudos to them. So with that said, again, it goes back down to you. What do you want? What do you need? How much do you want to spend? How long are you going to be there? What's the best option for you? So while polys are going to do a much better job than an acrylic will, polys will be harder to remove, a little bit less frequent, however, just as expensive. Acrylic is going to be a little bit more frequent, but it's going to be least on the cost scale, up on the more maintenance side. But once you add it all up, it's not going to be what it would cost to remove the poly in that X amount of time, and then even less with the epoxy. So with that said, in this type of scenario, you could literally go with an acrylic, a poly, or an epoxy. So like in a garage situation, right? That right there, that's epoxy. You're not going to do it. You're not going to do a poly. You're not going to do acrylic, because now the question is, well, how hard do you need it to be to perform the way that you need it to perform in the location that you're putting it in? That's why in garages you go with epoxies. With an epoxy, you have no choice. You don't have the poly choice. You don't have the acrylic choice. I mean, okay, let's be honest. Do you have the choice? Of course you do. But if you want it done right, you're not going to go this route. You're going to go this route, hands down. And with that side, now mind you, with epoxies, you have your base coat, you have your color coat, and then you have your top coat. Do not go cheap on that top coat, that top polyurethane coat. Actually, that top coat is a polyurethane. So it's dropped down with an epoxy. So let me see if I got this right. The first layer, I don't know where the camera's at, right? But the first layer when doing an epoxy floor is paint. The second layer when doing an epoxy floor is epoxy. The third layer when doing an epoxy floor is a poly. So these different layers do different things. So this one sets the base coat. So for those that are painters, right, you want to put your prime coat, your base coat before you put on your full coat, right? So the paint is literally just a base coat. Now, I'm not, privy to the technology with the paint coat, but I'm sure that the paint is a special type of paint. It's not just like some regular old paint. But at the end of the day, it's paint, right? So you would paint your base coat, probably like a black, like if you're gonna do something that's got those beautiful designs, usually in basements. Yeah, you'd go with like a black, right? So you got your black base coat, then you put your epoxy coat, then you put your poly coat. That poly coat that's on top, don't go cheap on it. That poly coat that's on top is what has that UV ray protection. And why do you want a UV ray protection? Is because UV ray protection or resistance is it resists it from turning yellow, or sometimes I've seen like a little, like an ugly green color. Now, if you are watching this video and you have an epoxy garage, I bet you any money that little foot or 2 feet right outside of your garage door where the epoxy rolls over is a different color than what's inside. And that's caused by the sun. Now that I said that, if sun points in your direction, right? Because I could be talking to somebody right here that has an epoxy floor, opens up the garage and it's perfectly the same color. Do you have sun that hits it? If you do have sun that hits it, how long does it hit it for? Versus others that sun hits that part all day long, every day, you're definitely going to have that different color right there. So that's where an epoxy would come into play, okay? So over here, back to the garage scenario, is that a car will go in and out of that area all the time. So now it's about durability and withstanding what's going to happen in that space, which then that takes precedence over everything else. Again, goes right back down to what do you got going on, Okay, so now let's go back to aesthetics as opposed to what you needed, how you needed to perform. So let's say in your backyard, right now we just did an example of a stamped concrete in the backyard. Now let's say your backyard has slate or bricks, right? So slate, bluestone, bricks. What else? What else can I think of? Limestone, travertine, usually in pool surrounds. Usually people that have pools. Think of those areas. Okay, so we'll start off with slate. You know what? No, we'll start off with slate, bricks, and bluestone. Usually slate, bricks, and bluestone all have what? Grout lines. Either grout lines, mortar joints, or what's that stuff called? Polymeric sand. Sorry, it's been a while. So, or polymeric sand. The point is that it has a gap. Okay? All of these are gaps. Wherever it is that you have gaps, if it's outdoors, moisture will go underground. Will. Not if, not might, will. When moisture gets under, moisture absolutely wants to evaporate. When it evaporates, evaporation occurs up. When it occurs up, it doesn't matter where it is going up. So if you find yourself having a tile outside that has gaps in spaces, you're going to have evaporation that wants to come out. And if you have a topical coating, whether it's an acrylic, a poly, or an epoxy, it is blocked right there. But what happens, water doesn't stop. It keeps going. All of these little guys underneath keep wanting to come out. And when it comes out, what it does is it pushes out to the left and to the right, to the left and to the right. And then what's crazy is that as it continues, it also builds pressure, it builds force. So what ends up happening as time happens and as expansion and contraction happens, so like let's say that you're in a 4-season state, you have expansion and contraction. This may change slightly, you know, if you're in Florida, California, or whatnot, right? We're different climates, so that brings another variable into the mix, is where do you live? You know, so it just continues going into your situation. I keep saying that because I want people to understand there is no the best. There is no 5-year sealer, 10-year sealer, 20-year sealer, 15-year sealer. And if there is, what makes it a 5, a 10, a 15, or 20-year sealer? Does it make it because it's harder? If it's harder, here are the associated costs. Is it that because if it's under X, Y, or Z conditions, it'll last that long? Because the truth is, if you have an acrylic and it's a 15-year warranted acrylic, well, the moment that you pour some acid on there, boom, it's a 1-day-old sealer because it took 1 day for you to get acid on there. And then that's where when you're looking at the website and you're looking at warranties, look at the verbiage and look at what's said. Hands down, 9 times out of 10, it's going to say something to the effect of, it's not responsible if X, Y, or Z happens. And normally, X, Y, or Z is an example of what you may or may not do. It's on you, not the product, because it's up to you to understand which product to put where and why. And that's what this video is all about. Help you, okay? So right here, what ends up happening is that it'll peel as time goes on, or it'll leave these ugly stains underneath. And the only way to fix it is to remove it. Once you remove it, then you can go ahead and either reapply the same product if that's what you wish, or apply a product that should have been on there if the one that you wished wasn't the one that should have been on there, right? Now, here's the other scenario. When you remove it, how do you remove it? Earlier, I mentioned if it's an epoxy, usually it's like sanding, or grinding. If it's a poly or a polyurethane, it's a super stripper. If it's an acrylic, then you're at a regular stripper. So if you're doing chemical removal, then it's just a matter of time. This is the easiest. This one is much harder. Again, this one right here is probably easily 3 to 4 times the cost of this. And then this one right here is exponentially more. But now the question is, if it's one of these, this is very hard. This right here is very easy. So with this, to remove it, you literally spray on the floor a liquefying stripper. That liquefying stripper, what it does is it reacts with the acrylic, loosens it up, scrub it, rinse it, extract it, pull it up. Maybe do it 2 or 3 times, but that's literally all you're doing. Spraying, scrubbing, extracting, making sure it's all even, looking at it from different angles, making sure it all comes up before you reapply whatever sealer it is that you decide to go with, right? If it's a poly, that's hard, because now what you have to do is you have to first identify what is this material made of, right? So the material that the coating is on, what is that material made of? Because then that determines how hard it is. By determining how hard it is, it determines how you can agitate it. And agitation is the key, because if something is very difficult to remove, and the way to remove it is by applying a super stripper, and any kind of stripper or product or anything like that, what it's meant to do, it's meant to loosen, undo, remove, liquefy, whatever it is that it's meant to liquefy. So in this case, a super stripper will liquefy a poly, but at a rate of very little. Now it depends on how many layers of polys were applied, because we've been to homes where a person just kept applying the coating on there every 2 years. So now we've got 3 or 4 layers of poly as opposed to just 1, which then determines how many times you got to go with the super stripper. And you want to go as aggressive as you can, but you're limited to the aggressive level based on what the material is, which then determines, are you going to use something soft or something hard? So here, let me show you this. All right, so you would not use either one of these for this scenario, but it's an example, okay? Right here you have 2 pads. Both pads agitate. Both pads have a level of aggression. This one can agitate without scratching. This one can agitate, but it can scratch depending on what it is. So this right here is something that needs to be determined by your service provider on which one it is that you're going to use. Now again, your outdoor exterior materials, it's going to eat this up. It's just going to tear it up. You wouldn't use that. Same thing with this, it'll eat it up even more because it's softer than the black one. You wouldn't use that either, okay? So just to give you an idea of how much goes behind even just the agitation of what you're applying. And we'll get into that in another video as far as how cleaning works and the technology behind cleaning. That's a whole other can of worms. But in this particular case, you would then now determine how hard you can use a super stripper to remove the poly depending on the material that's on there. Now, let's go back to what I suggested, right? So right here we had a brick, slate, and bluestone, okay? Brick is the hardest. Slate is the next hardest, I think. I would say that the brick and the bluestone might be comparable, but I'm sure one is harder than the other. Don't quote me on that one, but one is definitely harder than the other. By how much is the question? But one thing I know for sure, that slate is the one that's gonna be the least hardest of these 3 examples that I put up here. So then that just means that if you were to use a slate, you got to agitate with something that's less aggressive, which then increases how many times you need to redo it with your agitation method, which then increases time, which then increases cost. Those are the things to take into consideration when it comes to picking acrylic, poly, or an epoxy and location. So that was a ton of information. I know. And then again, back on the service side of things with CSI Absolute Clean, those are the things that we take into consideration when we're going out and doing a quote and identifying what needs to be done, which then reflects on the price that's provided for service. And then this also, what I just told you about this hardness and density, that also applies to water and to pressure, heat. Like it is definitely a rabbit hole of just more information and ability to determine what needs to be done, because water, man, water can cut depending on the pressure that goes through it. The stronger the pressure, the more it can cut. The less the pressure, now you're just rinsing. So it all depends. All right, so back to this. Topicals. What else can I think of? Topicals, well, you would think of acrylics will yellow easily. Polys will yellow a little bit harder, but it'll still yellow. Epoxies, even harder, but it'll still yellow. So then now the question is, where is this surface located in your home? Which direction is your home facing, and how much sun does it hit? It's another thing to take into consideration. Okay. What else can I say that I haven't already mentioned? Solids. Okay, so now what I'm going to focus on is the amount of product that's left behind. Okay, so this is something to take into consideration, especially if you're like a management company. You would oftentimes get quotes for people from contractors that you want to do a strip and wax job. And on that strip and wax job, on their quote, they say that they're going to apply 5 coats or 7 coats. And then in others, you'll see that they're going to apply, 2 coats or 3 coats. All right. So the reason behind that, and then this, I think, is more of a preferential type of a factor as opposed to what's good and what's bad, right? It really all depends on what you want done, okay? So what ends up happening is that when you're dealing with acrylics, acrylic comes in different levels of solids, okay? So the way to think of solids is think waxes contain solids. When you apply the product on the floor, when it dries through the process of evaporation. So if you have a 20%, we'll do easy math, right? So we'll do 20% solids. Well, when you apply 100% of the product on the floor, after it dries, 20% of the product is what remains. So now when you have something like 20% or even 24, 25%, you only want to do 2 to 3 coats, right? So let's do 20% solids. You would do 1 coat, 2 coat, 3 coats, okay? Let's say that you have a product that's 10% solids. And that particular provider told you that they're going to do 7 coats. Well, you could see that if it's 10%, it would be half of this. So then it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It ends up being the same thing. Now, where I will say this could be more beneficial than this is because usually when you lay a little bit at a time, it bonds more, clings more, and it stays on there more, a little tighter, right? Whereas if when you do like a 20%, you would do 3 coats. You do a 10%, you would do like something like 7 coats. Well, now you have time because the amount of time it takes to apply and to let dry 3 coats is less than the amount of time for 7 coats. So this is where my own personal opinion is that the benefit that comes from 7 coats doesn't outweigh the cost and benefit with just 3 coats. That's something to take into consideration. So that's something that's associated with acrylic. When it comes with poly, there's no evaporation. And if there is, I'm unaware of it, and it's very little. So basically, when you put in a poly down, 100% of the product that you put on there is 100% of the product that's gonna remain after it's dry. And then same thing with epoxies. And with epoxy, like I said earlier, it's a paint, it's an epoxy, and it's a top coat of a polyurethane. So that's where the differences are. So I guess this information is probably geared towards more the person that has vinyl floors or commercial establishments, and you're looking for different quotes and you don't understand why one is 7 versus 3, and then between all this it could be 5s, 2s, 1s, which I don't think anybody would ever put 1, but you never know. I've seen it all. So that's a big difference, and as far as acrylic goes and the amount of solids, and I think that's pretty much it to take into consideration. I don't know if I mentioned traction. So another thing to consider when deciding which one, I guess probably it'll connect more when I talked about epoxies in the cars, is, well, are you in a lobby? Are you in a hotel? When a hotel, how much traffic do you have? How much foot traffic do you have? You may not want to go with an acrylic because the amount of people that go in and out, and what's crazy is it's in a path. It's a particular path each and every time, because nobody walks along the side of the walls. It's always the middle. It's always the traffic lanes, right? So an acrylic will probably wear away pretty quickly. And then that's where a poly would come into play. So now, if you're using a poly, just know that the associated damage around the perimeter of where that epoxy is laid, you're going to have to do some associated touch-ups. But this is in those scenarios where if you're in a constantly foot traffic area, because another thing that hospitality groups and hoteliers, condominium buildings, lobbies, what they don't have is they don't have time. That's in one of those scenarios where there's probably more money than time, which then in their particular case, they would want to see us every 2 years as opposed to every 6 months. And then that's where it would make more sense to go with a poly. So all of these things to take into consideration. So I'm sure I could keep going. There's a lot more to it, a lot more scenarios. So if I didn't cover your scenario, please leave it in the comment section. Leave a question. Give me your scenario. Send me an email. Send me a picture. Let me see what you got going on. More than happy to give you my suggestion. Again, my suggestion is based on the more information you provide me. So if you provide me where, what, how long, sun, traffic, foot pattern, and what material, what do you have going on, like all of that is taken into account when deciding which is probably the best use case scenario. So with that said, if you found this information helpful, beneficial, please give it a thumbs up, give it a like, subscribe. YouTube loves seeing that. This is over 10 years in the making. I think we're at 14 years now. We're 14 years in the making, and we're bringing all this information knowledge to help you out. So let's get it to the masses. A ton of people want to know this information. It's the reason why we're in business. If there wasn't the people out there, then we wouldn't be in business for this long. So there's a lot of people that wants to know this. So please like, subscribe, comment below. Questions, suggestions, residential, DIY, or a contractor. If there's anything that you can do to add and bring benefit and information to this video, please leave it in the comment section. Again, remember that this channel is a share all, help all scenario. It's about helping and getting down to the best possible result for the situation of everybody involved, and to help give a little bit more information so you understand pros and cons to different types of sealers. All right. Thank you. Until the next one.